hoping it was.
So we still tell my daughter, and she hates that story. Sarah, when you were little, you staked the creature out of it and you put that thing on. It's on that one. Play that part. Oh, jeez. Okay. Alrighty. Let's talk about the 13 original colonies. We did New England yesterday, and so I'm going to go to the opposite extreme. We're going to do the southern ones today so that you can see the contrast in the two. And I'll use these handy-dandy overhead projector sheets. And then I'll lay them the right direction. Okay. All right, let's talk about the southern colonies. The first southern colony is which one? Virginia, very good. Jamestown, Virginia. It was the first English colony, right? And there are a few dates in history you should know. One of them is 1588. What happened in 1588? The defeat of the Spanish Armada. Right, yeah. And 1607 is when Jamestown was founded. The first English colony in the New World because it changes the history of the world. All right. Jamestown was settled by 100 men. It was all men. And why did these 100 men come over to the New World? What were they seeking? Gold. Very good, gold. Spain had taken lots and lots of gold home from the New World, so they were sent by England to look for gold. How many gold mines do you know of in Virginia? Goose egg, right? So, how successful were they in their search for gold? Yeah, they were not successful at all. There was no gold. And John Smith took control and made them start building houses for shelter and really saved the colony from extinction. It's ironic because he was a very loud man, a braggart. He loved to fight. And when he came off the ship at Jamestown, he was in leg irons. He had been put in jail on board because he kept provoking fights. And he turns out to be their great leader. So they learned how to plant corn, and they dug wells, they built shelter, and they barely survived their first winter. Okay. Their journey was paid for by the London Company. Okay, the London Company. The settlement was in the swamps of Virginia. It was in the Chesapeake Bay, and you need to remember that because on the AP test, a lot of times they don't call it Jamestown. They'll call it the Chesapeake Bay Colony, and that really confuses students. You'll forget which colony that is. So trying to remember. Like Puritans equal Congregationalists, Chesapeake Bay. Equals Jamestown, Virginia. All right, by the time they'd been there 7 months, there were only 53 men left. It was a tiny little band of men facing a winter. Most of them had died of malaria or starvation. Most of these men were indentured servants. Indentured servants. Somebody know what that is? What, Byron? I think you have it right. They come over and the London Company paid their way, and then they would have to work for 7 years for whoever paid the indenture, and then when they finished their indenture, then they could become a landowner themselves. So this was the labor supply in the South. So a person could get a free passage over in return for working 7 years for whoever paid their passage, with the hopes of owning land. And of course, these people would never have owned land back in Europe. Most of these were boys aged 15 to 24, so young men. And only 45% lived to be 24. Most of them died during their indenture. Their diets were very poor. Their work was very difficult. And so most of them died before they finished out their indenture. They were literally worked to death. They had to work even though they didn't have enough to eat and weren't healthy. You could go to a bar and get drunk, and when you woke up, you might find yourself on a ship to America, because people were wanting to send people over. They thought that it was a good investment, and they could make money by sending these people over. So some people were actually kidnapped and sent to America. Can you imagine going out and have a little bit too much to drink and wake up? We're going to America. Woo!
Secret passageways under the bars that go to the dock, right?
What now?
They had the secret passageways that were like under the bars, like from the bars to the dock. Right?
Oh, I didn't know about that. That's cool.
I think so.
Yeah.
I read that somewhere.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So they could like just take them that way and no one could know.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a bad wake-up call. Okay. So the Powhatan Indians, Powhatan, Powhatan, were ruled by Chief Powhatan. And they had helped the original settlers in Jamestown. But in the winter of 1609 and 1610, the English were starving and they began to raid villages. stealing food. And burning and killing some of the Indians. So the relationship between the settlers and the Indians went sour. It was known as the starving time, and cannibalism supposedly took place. In the spring 1610, new settlers arrived with supplies. Enabling the colony to survive. And then in 1614, a famous marriage takes place. Who's up on your Disney? Pocahontas is the daughter of Chief Powhatan. Whom does she marry? Which John? John Rolfe.
Never mind.
Yeah, John Rolfe, R-O-L-F-E. He's also famous for another reason. Does anybody know what John Rolfe did?
How did you say it, Wilson?
R-O-L-F-E. John Rolfe also discovered a type of tobacco that grew well in Virginia, and that became their chief money crop. The year 1619 was extremely important for Jamestown. 1619. The first African slaves arrived on Dutch ships. The first African slaves arrived on Dutch ships. Second, the first women arrived. A shipload of 60 women were sent by the London Company. Can you just imagine being one of the women getting off of that ship? Get all these slavering men out there. Sort of reminds me of, I had a friend that was single until she was in her 30s, and she was desperate to find a husband. So she traveled a lot too, and she went up to Alaska, and she decided she would go to the town that had the fewest women in the United States. So I can't remember the name of the town. She goes in this town, and the male to female ratio, you know, is just, there are just no females. And so she goes into this bar, and she's sitting there in this bar, and she's looking around, and she's like, ooh, ugh, ah. And she looks up, and in this bar, there's this sign. It says the name of the town. I can't remember what it says. Jamestown. You knew that the odds would be good. You just didn't know the goods would be so odd. She did not find her husband there. But hey, she ended up marrying a millionaire. She did. Yeah. Yeah, I ran into her in Nashville one time. I was riding on the school bus, and I was taking kids to see a play. She came in her little tight black pants, because she's never had any children. She's the same size she was when I knew her way back when. She had these black leather pants and her $1 million man. And as we were leaving, I was getting into the bus. And they came around us in their Jaguar and she waved at me. I was like, God. Why did my life turn out to be such a boring existence? It's depressing. You never know how life's going to turn out. So, she found her Prince Charming. Okay, the third important thing that happened was they elected their first House of Burgesses. They elected the first House of Burgesses. All landowners voted, and they chose 22 representatives to lead them. And this was the beginning of representative government in the New World. It was the beginning of representative government in the New World. Just to give you an idea of how well they were doing, in 1618, they exported 50,000 pounds of tobacco. In 1618, they exported 50,000 pounds of tobacco. But by the 1630s, they were exporting 1 million pounds of tobacco a year. And they were making lots and lots of money. And tobacco is eventually going to cause, it's going to ruin the Indian relations. We talked about this a little bit the other day. Remember Bacon's Rebellion? It occurs in Jamestown because they keep, tobacco wears the land out, and they keep moving further and further out onto Indian lands and taking it. And so Bacon's Rebellion occurred in Jamestown. All right, let's move on to the next southern colony, 1632. Maryland is founded. Maryland. If you look at the name of the colony, Maryland, it tells you a lot about its founding. Which Mary do you think it's named for? The Virgin Mary, the Mother of God. So, what might that tell you about the settlers? Which religion? Catholics. Very good. This was founded as a haven for Roman Catholics. What's the first city you think of in Maryland?
Baltimore.
Baltimore. That tells you more about the founding of the colony. Lord Baltimore was given this son by the king. Given this land by the king. And his son was the one who ended up settling it. It's known as a proprietorship. Most of the southern colonies are proprietorships. A proprietorship, it meant that the land had been granted to the king, by the king to a friend, and that friend, whoever he'd given the land to, could rule it as he saw fit, pass any laws that he saw fit to run his own colony. So, it's a proprietorship. It was run by Lord Calvert, who was Lord Baltimore's son, and he could govern it as he saw fit. All right, if the king gave you land in the New World, and you could govern it as you saw fit, okay, what do you think you'd do with that land? First of all, what would you want to happen from the land? If you got this new land? Money. You'd want to make money from it, right? What would be the best way to make money? How are you gonna make this land make money for yourself? What do you need? Yeah, it's a workforce. You need people to settle, right? People to settle. What's the best way of getting people to settle? What kind of laws would you pass?
Easy ones.
Yes, laws that were easy to obey, right? So all different kinds of people could come and settle. And that's what most of the proprietors did. Okay, they passed laws that allowed freedom of religion. Because they didn't really care what religion you were, they just wanted you to come settle to make money for them. So, Catholics poured into this area because it was named Maryland. It was advertised across Europe as a haven for Roman Catholics who'd been persecuted. But before long, there were more Protestants than there were Catholics. And so they got worried that the Protestants were going to abuse the Catholics. And so a very important act was passed. And it's called the Religious Toleration Act. Religious Toleration Act of 1649. The Religious Toleration Act of 1649. It guaranteed freedom of religion to all Christians. To all Christians. So which European group are they kind of leaving out of the picture? Who are the Europeans? Jewish people. They're leaving out, they're not welcoming Jewish people. All right, the next colony founded is 1663. It's the Carolinas. The Carolinas, North and South Carolina. 8 English nobles were given this land. 8 English nobles. Were given the land by Charles II. And they were all proprietorships. Okay. Freedom of religion was allowed, and they had representative government, and they had trial by jury. And this was true of all the proprietorships. Maryland was the same way. Okay. Do not get confused on the exam, because they'll ask you the main crops that were raised during the colonial era. And in the South, what do we always think of as the main crop in the South? Cotton. Not during the colonial era. Okay? It's tricky. They'll trick you up with that, all right? They'll trip you up, so don't fall for it. All right, the main crops were tobacco, rice. A lot of the slaves came from the West Indies knowing how to raise rice, and they brought that knowledge with them. So huge rice plantations developed. Indigo, you don't know what indigo is? It's a plant that makes a dye color, indigo. Naval stores, N-A-V-A-L, doesn't have anything to do with your belly buttons. We don't want to talk about naval stores, right? Yeah. N-A-V-A-L, all right, which is pitch, rosin, and turpentine. Naval stores are pitch, rosin, and turpentine. Those are materials that you need to build ships. So shipbuilding materials. They're sending it back to England, and England is building ships. They also traded in furs. And skins. Okay, the plantation system developed in the South. And in the back country, there were small scattered farms. If a person wanted to migrate, basically that person would get in a boat and go down river somewhere and find some land that wasn't claimed, and they would set up, buy the land and set up a farm there. And so you have small scattered farms, usually along waterways, with large distances between towns. Very different way of settling than New England. All right, the task system developed on the plantations, the task system, what does that mean? You may know?
Where you go somewhere but you have to work for so long, something like that.
It was part of the slavery system. You would be given a task to do for the day, you'd be told what your tasks were, and after you finish your tasks, you could work for yourself. So some slaves had time to raise their own gardens, to raise some animals, some pigs, and sometimes they sold their labor into town, and that's how some slaves bought their freedom. So the task system was used on the large plantations. All right, so that's all North Carolina. South Carolina, or I need to say one more thing about North Carolina. Most of those settlers came from the Chesapeake Bay Colony. They couldn't get land anymore at Jamestown, so they migrated to the Chesapeake Bay, from the Chesapeake Bay to North Carolina. Okay, South Carolina. The earliest settlers came from Barbados. Have any of you ever been to Charleston, South Carolina? It's so beautiful, isn't it? If you go in October, they have a tour of homes. It's really fun to go to. They open up 10 of the mansions. You get to tour. I just love doing that. They brought with them the knowledge of growing rice. And so you have large rice plantations again. The most important city was Charlestown. Why would they name it Charlestown? King Charles II, yeah. Charleston. Why was Charleston such an important city in the South? Any idea, anybody? Yes, exactly right. It was the only southern port deep enough for ocean-going vessels. So all international trade flowed through Charleston, in and out of Charleston. Okay. The population was more diverse than any other colony. Population was more diverse than any other colony in the South. Scottish people came. Scots Irish. Germans. West Indians. French Huguenots. What are Huguenots?
Explorers? No.
You guys remember what a French Huguenot was? We talked about the other day. We talked about the French settling way up. They wouldn't let the French Huguenots come over because the king said they couldn't spread heresy. Yes, French Protestants. And a lot of European Jews settled in Charleston. Okay, so they made their living from rice plantations, from naval stores, fur trade, indigo, the same as North Carolina. All right, one more colony before we finish for today, so we can finish it. The last one is very interesting, it's Georgia. 1732. You guys tell me why Georgia was founded.
Oh, 'cause they sent all the criminals there, right?
Yes, we talked about it the other day. They sent all of the debtors, right? They set them loose from prison in England. They released the debtors from prison in England and sent them to Georgia.
Didn't we do that with Australia too?
That was, yeah, the
Okay.
English, the British were sending, yeah. James Oglethorpe, Oglethorpe. Was the proprietor. Have you guys ever seen a Oglethorpe College or signs for that when you go through Atlanta? He called it the Great Social Experiment. Why did he send these debtors down? What was the purpose of Georgia?
Buffer zone for the Carolinas.
Exactly, to be a buffer zone for the Carolinas. If the Indians were gonna attack, they were gonna kill these people that didn't matter, right? All these prisoners. So the people who went there were given 50 acres apiece. And they're supposed to defend the colonies from Indian attacks. Other people begin to pour in, so you have other people from New England coming down. A lot of Germans and Scots also settled there. If you ever go to Charleston, be sure you go on the Ghost Walk. They have a really fun Ghost Walk down there. I think I already told you the story when we were doing the Civil War about the doctor and his wife that gave the best parties. Yeah, that was in Charleston. All right, generalizations about the South. In general, what can you say about the South? Let's contrast this with New England. What was the main way of making a living in New England? Shipping, right? Shipping, trade, because of all the deep harbors. Fishing, right? Cod and cod, that's New England. How do people make a living in the South? Agriculture, huge farms. Why didn't they have large farms developing in New England, Randy? Why didn't they have large farms developing in New England?
Because it was more of a harbor area and they didn't have the right type of soil and stuff because it's rocky.
Yes, the soil was too rocky. So it's geography that's causing these differences. They love to approach this question from why are these colonies different and what caused the differences? So geography. All right, the South was largely rural. There were scattered farms and plantations along rivers with huge distances between them. What about education in the South? Well, let's first talk about how does that vary, largely rural scattered farms and plantations, how's that different from New England? How did they settle in New England?
Got too big, they didn't gather people and we just
Exactly. Whenever they had no more land to give out in one town, a whole group of people would go out together and build another town, right? And they would establish a church and school and establish another town. So they always very closely connected by towns, not so in the South. okay, scattered populations, they had no loyalty to each other. All right, the school system, in New England, how did they educate their kids?
You had to go to school.
They set up state-supported schools, right? The Duluth-Satan Act. In the South, there were no public schools. There were no public schools. Plantation owners usually had tutors who lived in their homes and taught them. And they might teach other plantation owners' children who might come over. But most Southerners were illiterate. All right, in New England, what about religion? What's the dominant religion? The Puritan religion, Congregationalists in New England. And they did not allow much religious diversity, right? They were very severe. All right, well, you did have some religious freedom developing by people who moved away, right? And allowed religious freedom, like Thomas Hooker in Connecticut, okay, in Rhode Island. In the South, there were few churches. And most of the churches that were in the South were Anglican. They were still deeply connected to England. What's a typical lifespan for a Northerner? Will?
Pretty old. They could live a long time because in the winter they didn't have to go out and see each other and pass diseases.
Good, that's right. Because of the climate, right? The winter weather would kill out germs and diseases, and plus it kept them in their homes isolated from each other. In the South, there was a very high mortality rate for men. And this really influenced their entire social structure. Because women usually married several times. The husband would die, and then she would marry again. And so in the South, a large system of step families developed. In New England, were there slaves? Very few slaves in New England. Why didn't they need slaves?
Didn't need a farm.
They didn't have the huge plantations, right? And who did they have to do the labor?
The people who had debt,
Oh, that's in the South.
Themselves.
Right, they're children. They had many children, and they all lived and were healthy. And so their children provided their own labor sources. In the South, you need labor, right? And so where did the South turn for labor? Slaves. Yes, there was a huge population of slaves in the South. In South Carolina, by 1720, 70% of the population was slaves. 30% white, 70% slaves. It's mind-boggling. So, slavery develops in the South. What about the populations of New England? Are they multicultural? Are they homogeneous? What do they look like? They're very homogeneous, aren't they? Mostly English people. What about the South? Very diverse populations. A lot of poor and unskilled workers in the South. And the settlers in New England, especially the ones who came for Massachusetts Bay, they all brought trades with them. They were wealthy artisans. All right, the center of the life in New England was what? The center of life in New England. The church. Right? Their government was a theocracy, right? Okay. The center of life in the South, the political center of life, were pubs. Totally different. People gathered in pubs to talk politics. And they were not nearly as dedicated to religion as New England. Now that's shifted, didn't it? Because now where's the Bible Belt in the U.S.? It's in the South, isn't it? Yeah. But in the early times, New England was the most religious sector. Right. Any questions about the Southern colonies? All right. If you get a question, it'll probably be comparing and contrasting these two regions. Okay, that's what they'll ask you to do, and they'll want you to tell them why it happened as it did, why the differences occurred.